Hello, and welcome to the podcast Fearless with Uduaka Mimo. Mental health is our focus this month. It's an issue central to the life and work of my guest, Mohsin Mohi-Ud-Din, straddling family and community in the United States and the disputed territory of Kashmir. Mohsin is a witness, survivor, and teller of stories. His life's work through his organization, MeWe International, is in helping vulnerable people process their traumatic experiences to write and rewrite as needed their own stories. Mohsin, hello and welcome to Fearless.
Thank you so much for having me. This is an honor. I'm excited to talk to you.
Mohsin, where does your story begin?
Um, I would. Wow, where does it begin? Uh, I don't know where it begins, but when I think of that question, I just recall memories, memories being shuttled back and forth between America, where I was born, in a privileged setting, I might add. But going back to Kashmir, the disputed territory that happens to be in between two nuclear armed rivals. And at the time that I was being shuttled back and forth between America and Kashmir, I feel like that's where my consciousness started to expand in terms of what I saw my family and my community going through at the height of the conflict in the late 80s and early 90s.
So, this is where your consciousness begins to expand. At what age would you put that? At what age do you recognize that in this, setting, X, Y, and Z happen, violence, all sorts, and then in this other setting, it's calm and I'm safe and I'm okay.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I would say as young as like 6, 7. When you're in Kashmir in the 90s, it was one of the most militarized places on earth. There was over half a million uh, paramilitary forces, right? So just a kid, you're going from Montgomery County, Maryland, and tree-lined streets, and then you're in Kashmir, and there's you know soldiers everywhere, tanks. You know, uh, there was a lot of childhood memories in Kashmir of hiding in a bunker because there's gunfire or shelling or bombing happening right outside our gate, um, and just witnessing grief and anger. A kid knows. Children are present. They know, even if adults think that they don't. Children are very in tune with their environment. Um, and I was aware enough to know also the privilege that I had of being able to leave, and my family and those I love and millions of people in Kashmir are not able to leave. And it's the same in many other parts of the world, right? So that contrast is a very schizophrenic upbringing. That as an adult, when I look back now, it allowed me to be able to hold multitudes. You can hold grief and pain and loss at the same time as you can hold joy and gratitude and hope. Um, People can be victims as well as perpetrators. It's not all black and white. So from a young age, I was kind of forced to accept a lot of things and the multitude of things. And not anyone is one thing. None of us is one thing or one story or one event, right?
Well,
Uh,
Chimamanda talks about that, Chimamanda Adichie, the danger of a single story. So
mm,
Kashmir is disputed between India and Pakistan. I think China also has some sort of territorial claim
yeah.
in the midst of all of that. And you're talking about your childhood experiences of grief, pain, joy, victims and perpetrators embodied in one. What do you experience? What does your family experience?
Yeah. I just to honor my family and also the fact that most of my family don't have the privilege of leaving, and they have to endure more than I have to endure on a daily basis. So in no way am I equating myself with my brothers and my sisters in Kashmir who have to live with constant injustice and gaslighting. But what what I endured was I almost felt like an observer. I mean, I'm a survivor, and we can talk about that. And I've directly survived discrimination and abuse and violence from the conflict. But I also felt more like an observer. There is a reason why, I feel this calling and this responsibility for storytelling, which, by the way, is a completely butchered term and people misuse it all the time. And it's like a trendy thing. But for me, it's a way of life. And for me, it's medicine. And because I'm American and Kashmiri, people felt very open with me ever since I was young to talk to me because they knew that I had some degree of distance and separation from everything as well. And so I kind of, from a young age, I always felt like a container for other people's stories. And in the process of being a container, I noticed that people I loved and people in my community, those that talked to me and were sharing things about what they've been through and survived, there was something cathartic about that process for them and for me because I learned a lot. So Kashmir for me is everything. I wouldn't be where I'm at today without those roots.
You talk about, and I want to be careful as I also respect, as you say, your brothers and sisters in Kashmir. But you talk about surviving violence, surviving abuse. What exactly did you go through?
Um, I grew up in a community and environment where, uh, and not just for me, but for a lot of people in my generation, just physical abuse and violence in your community was tolerated and normalized. And that's separate from the violence from war and conflict, which if you also have to endure that, and there's over 400 million children living within 50 kilometers of armed conflict today. The violence is just exacerbating things that are also existing traumas within their community or in their home. In Kashmir, um, I witnessed family members be arrested and tortured. I lost my aunt Aisha, who was murdered by the paramilitary forces. I saw what that did to my best friend and her son, my cousin, when he lost his mother to the violence. And I saw the breakdown in family and community that happens from generation to generation, and how pain and suffering and injustice that is internalized and suppressed, that will pass on from generation to generation. And we know this now through science. It's epigenetics. It proves and shows how we live with that in our blood and our DNA. Um, and you know the so there's like these aftershocks of what happens to a people in a community, when they are enduring chronic stress, chronic uncertainty, violence, gaslighting, uh, systemic injustice. But then there's just the direct, right? I survived a bomb attack when I was young, and those moments don't leave you. Those moments, can either shape you or completely destroy you. Um, and there were real life or death moments, that I faced in Kashmir. In the States as well, but, also just in my global travels and doing the work that I do. But Kashmir was almost like it was like a preparation for me. And again, I say this with complete like awareness of the privilege with which I was able to be in and be out of Kashmir. And most people don't have that luxury or that privilege.
So, what does this do to you? Because you talk about the awareness, the emergence of the consciousness of the difference in the American and Kashmiri context. People start confiding in you, and that's cathartic for them and for you. Um, but you talk about people growing up in violence. You work with people who are processing traumatic experiences. So, at what point does it come to you that this is not normal, this is not right, and this is taking a toll on me.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. So everything I'm sharing is personal, but it's also based on the what I do in the world with my changemaker work. My personal, myself and my changemaker journey are inherently tied together. I can't separate the two. Um, so, when you are living in a situation of profound stress and uncertainty and fear, just in your day to day life, the story that your brain is telling your body, it gets hijacked by a lens of survival mode, survival mode, survival mode. And what ends up happening to your body and your brain and your thoughts and your actions is everything is through that lens of fight, flight, freeze. And that's just all of us dealing with stress every day, uncertainty every day, right? You add in events, trauma, trauma, which, trauma is a lived experience that, as Dr. Gabor Mate says, it robs you of the present and it keeps you in this cycle of either the past or the future. So if you combine trauma and uh, severe like adverse events into that existing way that the human body is built to navigate chronic stress and fear, you start losing control of connectedness to yourself. You start feeling disconnected to your body because all the energy is being pushed towards survival and defense and protection and fear. And that affects your physical health, your mental health, your relationships, the goals you set in life, the choices you make, your behaviors, your internal story and your connectedness to it authors your physical and mental health, which thereby writes the story of how you engage with the people and planet around you. And so, if we lose control and connectedness to how we communicate within ourselves, we lose control, we lose our agency with how we navigate this world. And then you're in a situation of helplessness and humiliation, which millions of children I see are living with today, and they have been. You know what I mean? 1 in 77 people in this world is a displaced person. Um, you know, child and adolescent mental illnesses are increasing when it comes to anxiety and depression. Suicide is one of the biggest killers of young people today. Um, and even for adults, healthcare workers and physicians and surgeons have, in some cases, have higher suicide rates than people in the military. And the pandemic didn't help either, by the way. Um, so that's the de-storying that can happen within a person. The de-storying, which is the silencing of your narratives, the disconnectedness to your own self and your own narratives and your own story and experiences, and the hijacking of your brain and body to thinking that your thoughts are facts and that you are this one thing, you are this one mistake, you are this one event, you are this one thing the world says you are. But we are also capable of restorying, and restorying we see all around us in nature. There are rhythms in nature. The trees know when to grow leaves and when to drop them. The birds know when to migrate, right? Humans have same internal rhythms, and when you reconnect with those rhythms, you can restore yourself and the world around you. And that involves awareness, self-compassion, perspective taking, and creative expression. And these are kind of the gateways for healing and restoring yourself and the world around you. So the stories and words I carry within me, Uduak, shapes how I will hold you and hold the world that you and I are both standing in. Right. And it's the same for you with me. It's interdependent.
Indeed, I think we already hold each other, Mohsin.
Yeah.
Look, I am curious, and remember the frame of our conversation is connection, and you've told us about that in terms of internal connection to one's own self and others and the body, connection, courage, curiosity, and care. And so I'm curious about you and when you become aware of your own mental ill health
Hmm.
and the steps you take to restore your connection to yourself.
Love
How old
that.
are you? What's going on? What is your process?
Yeah, I love that you're asking this, and it, and this podcast, this fearless podcast, I think is going to be the way you're approaching it by asking these questions, going to be medicine for myself and for others. So, because look, in the change maker work that people are doing, especially with the medium with which we communicate, everything is very curated, and everyone's getting awards and publishing and traveling and this and that.
You were in Time magazine,
And
Muslim.
yes, yes, I was. But can
Yeah.
I tell you, this is interesting because this relates to your question, Adwa. The day that I was being interviewed by Time magazine, the day I'm sitting in a chair getting makeup on, camera in my face, getting mic'd up, I get a notification on my phone. It says I have negative funds in my bank account. Okay. This is as I'm getting as I'm being interviewed by Time magazine. So people might see, and I encourage them to watch the Time magazine films and pieces.
They're on YouTube. Let me just plug you because you're not plugging
Thank you.
yourself. But
I appreciate it.
yeah.
They're on YouTube on Time Studios YouTube channel. Um, but there's an understory to everything. Just like the trees in the forest, we see the overstory, but there's an understory. There's mycelium networks, fungal networks, insects, all these things happening under the ground that we don't see. And we have to talk about these things. These things need to see some sunlight as well, right? And so your question is really important. I, as a survivor, but also as a practitioner, suffer from PTSD, suicidal thoughts, anxiety, and those are lifelong journeys. And there's this trend in changemaker work, humanitarian work, culture of self care, self care, self care. And yes, it's a very important concept, but there's a misconception in our 30-second reel Instagram world we're living in where self care is not an act, it's a practice, and it's a lifelong practice. And the way self care works, which is how restorying works, is you take a couple steps forward and you're gonna inevitably take a couple steps back. And you're gonna take a couple steps more forward and you're inevitably gonna take a couple steps back. So the first step for me is realizing and being connected to what my body is telling me. So those listening, there's this famous book, The Body Keeps Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, right? He writes about this, and there's a lot of science since he's written that book over the last decade that proves that, a large percentage of what we see from one another and feel from one another and ourselves comes from body language and the body. So I already know if I'm getting a migraine, if my head is feeling cloudy, if I'm not even aware of what my breathing is like, if I am hyper reactive to what my children are doing or hyper reactive to my life partner, my wonderful wife, Amber, then my body is trying to tell me something. But we live in a culture where we are not allowed the reprieve in this capitalistic systems that we live in of just slowing down for a minute and listening to and not judging ourselves. So this is the second part. You can have awareness, which is the first step of what you're feeling physically, but don't. People judge themselves. And this is where the self-compassion comes in. And again, we're living in a world that would have us judge ourselves more than we hold ourselves more with compassion. That's a problem. So I have to remind myself to be compassionate in those moments and instances. So listening and awareness is my first step. Then it's self compassion. Then it's action. And for me, my medicine is in storytelling. And I have practices that I do that involve reflection and writing and gratitude and journal practices. Gratitude has been, there's a lot of research around how it literally rewires your brain and your nervous system if you do it in a routine, consistent way, not if you do it once a week. But if you practice things like gratitude and writing out your gratitudes and also listing out the things that are triggering you, there's there's a process in your nervous system and your brain synapses that is working for you in those moments because you're releasing it, right? The second thing for me is I know what I need. Everyone in the work that I do around the world, we have something called a heart maze, and it's a practice where you identify the daily challenges or things that trigger you, but then like what are the things you know in those moments you have to do to recalibrate, to find your rhythm again. And for me, it's creativity, so writing, playing music, gratitude practices. It's being in nature. That's the other thing. So, getting sunlight, moving my body amongst the trees. I'm privileged in that I have access to nature, and a lot of millions of people around the world don't because of systemic injustices and inequalities. Those are key things that I need every day, to maintain my rhythm, and learning how to say no. A lot of us in this fearless podcast network and movement that you're building, Adawak, have to say yes to a lot of things because we're builders and we're creators and we're hustling to do good in this world, which requires us to put ourselves out there. At the same time, I've learned in 15 years of doing this work around the world, if you don't protect your energy, and if you are saying yes to everything, even if your intuition and the values don't align with whoever it is that you're going to be doing something with,
Or you just received a notification of negative account
or you
balance.
see or you see the notification that, then you got to check yourself and say no,
Hmm.
and you got to set boundaries. And there's this famous person that created this like online platform for healing and self-care called the Nap Ministry. And yeah, and I think she's American. She's an African American woman,
She's
and
African American. Her name escapes me at the moment.
she's brilliant.
Um, yeah.
And she has this saying in the Nap Ministry, which is on Instagram. You guys should check it out. It's called "Rest is Resistance."
Yeah.
And there's this famous saying in Buddhist practices where, you reflect that I am the rest between two notes. So in music and composition, there are notes, but there's also rest. There's literally symbols for resting in music. And it's the same for our body. It's the same for our self care, for our stories. It's the same in our cultures. And that's really important. And that gets really underestimated because we're constantly in hustle mode. Um, and then for me, the last thing, honestly, Uduak, is my children. Because it's like, hey, man, don't take yourself so seriously all the time. You know what I mean? Like, my children really ground me and remind me of the wonder and the awe. And, those of us that have survived trauma, those of us that have survived systemic injustice, that deal with uncertainty every day, the story that is hijacking our thoughts and our systems and beliefs is that the world is trying to take us out, that this earth is trying to swallow us every day. So, how am I going to tackle it? What do I got to look out for? At the same time, let's have some humility in acknowledging that the world is also working for us, that the universe is also working for us. As Paulo Coelho writes in The Alchemist, right? This world is conspiring for you, not against you all the time. And then your perspective starts to grow and expand. I think perspective taking is such a key element in mental health. It's also a key element in terms of being a leader and a change maker in this broken world that we're living in, and reminding ourselves that this world is broken, but I am not broken. I am not broken. And how can I ensure that I stay that way? And sometimes that means you have to have distance and you have to set boundaries, and protect your light.
Right. Now, this is incredibly wise. And there's also, sort of I'd probably say unproven anecdotal evidence that, people who survive trauma, people might call them old souls. You're forced to grow up and you're forced to, um, extrapolate about the world.
Yeah.
I'm very curious, and I'm asking you again, at what age do you begin to process to see that, this isn't wrong and I need to take steps to correct it? I need to, to use your term, restory myself, reauthor some of my narratives. At what point do you recognize, maybe I need therapy or I need support? When do you build up the practice of caring for yourself in such beautiful and tender detail as you've shared with us.
And thank you. Again, for me, it was since I was a kid because I have a tattoo on my arm. It says, "Nobody came but hope."
Mm.
My son wrote that in his journal, by the way.
I was just about to say that to let our listeners know that I believe you've got your children's names tattooed
Yeah, I got
on.
the times they were born tattooed
Yeah,
on my arm here. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
uh,
Okay.
but
Hmm.
that what my son wrote, "Nobody came but hope." What he wrote and the fact that he wrote it, that was my awareness and my medicine. Since I was a child, I witnessed there was a lot of angry people around me, man. And it wasn't their fault. It was people were dying and getting sick and being kidnapped and killed and gaslit. And when you're growing up as a, again, I told you, I
And
work with,
when you say gaslit, because you're using that term just for people who've heard it, and their reality is being denied. This is what
yes,
you mean. They're being told they are the ones who are crazy,
right,
and that the craziness around them is normal, and they're
yeah,
abnormal for having some sort of traumatic response
yeah.
to the craziness around them.
Yeah, being gaslit is essentially being denied the right to be validated and bared witness to, even though something you know is happening to you, and others know that it's happening to you, but they pretend like it's not, on purpose, right? So when you're a child and living in that, and children are present, I work with children and youth all around the world, thousands of them. They are present, and they see and they learn from what is modeled before them. I didn't want to become another angry man in this broken world. And when you see abuse and violence and suffering and injustice around you, you again in Kashmir, I saw that and I lived it firsthand because it was so extreme. But I'd be in America, right? Back in America, back in Maryland, privilege, safety, you know what I mean? Running water, no soldiers on the streets, food in the fridge. I was forced to see these very different realities and hold multitudes, and I had to make sense of it. And my medicine for that was creativity, creative practices, writing, drawing, talking to myself, talking to trees. I would talk to trees when I was a kid. I'd have conversations with trees because I felt like they were safe, and I wasn't in a safe environment. And the big moment for me was my aunt Aisha was murdered by the paramilitary forces in Kashmir. And this person who I loved, my cousin, her son, right, Khalid, I saw him after she was killed in these, there are these prayer ceremonies that happened when you lose somebody and people are reading Quran. And he's standing there as a child and I'm watching him. And I'm an empath since I was a kid. So I'm feeling him. His body language was different. His hands were balled up in a fist. His eye contact was gone, right? His breathing was heavy, and the body keeps the score. And he lost connectedness to himself and then, was in a dangerous way. And he was very vulnerable, like millions of kids are vulnerable. I was just in Nigeria with kids, youth, peace builders that are from the Northeast Nigeria. Same situation. They're vulnerable. And I knew that I had to just listen to him and be next to him and not get burned by the fire inside of him, but be able to stand around the fire and keep my hands warm so that he knew that I was next to him. And that ability that I have and others have, but from a young age, to not be afraid of darkness, not be afraid of grief and loss, and to sit with it and to sit with people that are holding that fire and not get burned, but figure out how we can use this fire to keep warm and to keep connected and to have light and to see where we step next. That's just something that's been in me since I was a kid.
Mm. So tell us about Nigeria, because you just were there last week, I believe.
Yeah, just
And
got
you're
back.
with in the Northeast, where people have been experiencing insecurity as a result of militant violence from Boko Haram.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So I was in well the UNODC and this wonderful team that's really passionate about child protection. They selected 30 Nigerian peace builders who are from the Northeast, Adamawa and Yobe and Borno places, and they came to Abuja, and it was a gathering and a training of what skills and tools can we learn from them, but also give them to further them in their peace building journey for child protection. And what you and I are talking about here is very connected, right? In terms of my story, we think of systemic change and we talk about education, child protection, ending violence, peace building. We can't talk about these things if we're not also addressing and learning how the brain talks to the body and how our internal stories and our skills of communication impact our health and our relationships and one another and community building. So that was a really passionate space that we were in because we were applying everything I'm talking about here about communication and health and community building and resilience. We applied it to peace building with these incredible Nigerian youth peace builders who are dedicating their lives and risking their lives to protecting children who are vulnerable because children in that place are traumatized. The poverty rate is one of the highest in the world. The inflation is the worst it's been in 17 years. There's girls that have been kidnapped for going to school because of rising extremism and the threat of that. So we have to address the head and the heart, not just politics or not the SDGs of the UN and these development goals. We have to address the internal technology. It's not AI.
Mhm.
It's this
And
and it's this.
yeah, and when you talk about that, I imagine you having sessions about the brain and talking about the limbic brain, amygdala, prefrontal cortex,
Yeah.
and the different functions in terms of learning, executive
Yeah.
function, and fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses.
Yeah.
So that's Nigeria, but you were in Gaza
Mm-hmm.
earlier this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Gaza is unrelenting,
Yes.
even though we would like it to relent.
Yes.
Um, what was that like?
Yeah, that was, and I really appreciate you asking that about that experience. So I was in a medical aid humanitarian mission with Med Global. I was in Gaza with doctors and nurses from around the world to give aid and support to displaced families. So we were in Rafah in March. Um, it was an out of body experience, and I I had so many people telling me not to do this, and I'm talking like people I
Why
look.
not? What were they saying?
Don't do this. Why are you doing this? There's nothing you can do. You're not going to come back alive. Questioning my intentions. Why are you, what do you think you're doing? Who do you think you are? You know, because in March, Gaza, and it's gotten worse, unfortunately, now, but that was active, it's active war, right? So you're going to be taking explosions and bullets and witnessing starvation and malnutrition and death every day, which I did. Um, there's this wonderful Palestinian journalist, and I forget her name, but she she said it so beautifully recently that she's like, there was a time where Gaza needed the world, but now the world needs us. The world needs Gaza because what I witnessed there was true resilience and community in the face of complete like desperation. Like Gaza taught me so much, so much, and it lives within me as like this evolving thing that I'm still processing. I was terrified. I didn't know if I was going to make it out, and there were moments where I didn't feel like I was going to see my kids. Laying on the floor at night, sleeping on the floor, and you feel the vibrations of the shelling and explosions in the middle of the night, the whole night for 8 straight days, waking up to the smell of smoke, and you see black smoke in the distance. covering, the blue sky. And, in that moment, people's histories and joys and memories and dreams and hopes are being erased in that moment when you see that black smoke. Um, children were starving. And you enter a context like that, and all of us, right, that are engaged in this type of work, in being of service to this world, you start to doubt yourself. What the hell am I doing here? What could I possibly do? Who am I? Who do I think I am? You know? And then I start to, the first day, I was doing sessions in communication, um, communication and mental health, like community-based mental health, psychosocial support, but using communication skills building and storytelling and art. And so I walk into this tent. These kids have lost family members, parents. These mothers have lost their husbands. The kids are dehydrated and haven't eaten, you know. And I walked in there, and they were ready. They were present. They were hungry, but they were also hungry for connectedness and being validated and for expressing their stories. And I know it sounds so bizarre, but they gave me such knowledge and energy that in that moment I surrendered to where I was at, and I reminded myself that everything I've survived has brought me to this moment, in this place, as the bombs are falling, as people are starving. You have been prepared for this moment, and these people have been prepared for this moment, and you are here together. What are you going to do? If you can give 5 minutes of reprieve and awareness to people, that's a success. And especially in an environment of loss and grief and war and active, injustice, right? And that's what we did. But it was through community. Community is the thing. Community is the destination, is the purpose, is the intention. And if you can maintain communication within the community, then the resilience of that community will thrive, even if the bombs are falling, even if people are enduring horrific injustice. And, we started with music and teaching them rhythm notation and listening to music. Because if you listen to music and play music, it does something to the attention and focus in your body and your nervous system, right? As a group, it just takes you out, right? And they started to find their rhythm. And by the way, there were armed drones buzzing above us and explosions in the distance. But we were making our own noise. We were talking back to the world, not accepting the world as it is, right? But talking back, making our own rhythms. Then we moved into breathing as a group. And there was this Gaza's a noisy place. You hear drones, you hear explosions, you hear screaming, you hear lots of things. We did this breathing practice at WAC, and it's like the silence was louder than the chaos of war. And this mother had her 3-year-old child on her lap doing this with her. And she looked at me and she said, "This is the first time I do not feel the war." That to me is like everything. And she did that. And the fact that she did that, then there's like a self-awareness and a self-esteem. Oh man, what if I have to be in survival, right? People in Gaza have to be in survival mode because everything's trying to take them out. Everything's weaponized: food, the air, the water, right? Even the night sky, there are drones all the time and explosions. So they have to be in survival mode. But can you write a story for yourself where you have 1 minute or 5 minutes of reprieve, of self-compassion, you know? And that is medicine too. And they did that. And they ended up, I brought these empty cloths and paints, and they ended up writing and painting stories, positive message based stories on these cloths. And those cloths there were rugs, basically big, and they created their own prayer rugs, their own prayer mats and prayer carpets and meditation carpets. And the release was incredible. And we measured it as well, right? Over 70% of the people that I worked with in Gaza, including doctors and healthcare workers that we worked with, who also we have to heal the healers as well. They reported that they felt connectedness, they felt more empowered,
They felt
um,
cared for.
they felt cared for. And the first thing I said when you're in a place of such loss, I said, I travel across the world to be here with you because you deserve nothing less. And when you're standing in the same place and you could be taken out with those brothers and sisters at any second, they're paying attention. And the thing that connected us, I have to say, connects to this conversation, Edouard, was the first thing, anywhere I went, whether it was a children's, clinic or, a hospital or just, where are you from? Where are you really from? You know, and I'd say, Asli Kashmir, like my origins are in Kashmir. And they knew about Kashmir because they're going through and they have been going through the same thing my people have been going through, right? We talk about not being validated and gaslit, not having your pain addressed, having your pain and injustice normalized in culture and society, being, being surrounded by military and all these things. And that was such a strong bond. And it was this beautiful moment where my past and my ancestry and my present and my future, it all prepared us and connected us for this moment, Kashmiri and Palestinian. There were kids that knew about Kashmir that smiled when I said Kashmir. Ah, Kashmir. And they would tell me, there's Harb. Harb is war. Like war there too, yes. And so something beautiful that happens at Wak when we, the survivors, become the noisemakers. There's something beautiful that can come from that. You know,
The
uh,
troublemakers, as John Lewis would say.
yeah, good trouble. Good trouble. Exactly.
So look, and before Gaza, there was Syria, and you've made two films out of the war in Syria,
Hmm.
and I believe Time bought your two films.
Yeah.
I get a sense that there is a process to your work, and you've shared some of that about Nigeria and with Gaza.
Hmm.
Tell us about the filmmaking, because you're also a filmmaker.
Yes.
And there's Fatima by the Sea.
Yeah.
Um,
Sammy.
Now the sea is within her.
Yes.
Um, and I imagine it was quite a shift because the sea would have been a source of trauma
Hmm.
at some point,
Hmm.
and then now it's this thing that is within you, and it's a positive thing.
Yeah, it's a well to
It's
drink from.
Yes, it's so well. Tell us about that.
Well, that's a great. Again, I appreciate you asking about it. So, yeah, for over 10 years, I've been working with Syrian refugees, not inside Syria, but along the border in the refugee camps on the Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon. Um, and my first year, over 10 years ago, in the Syrian refugee camp, I had no funds. I had one camera, and I had one small organization that was like, "We need something." So just we'll give you access, but what can you do? And Fatima, the subject of my short documentary, was one of the first people I engaged with. And when I first met her, she had trouble making eye contact. She had trouble speaking. She had trouble putting a word to a feeling. And I've known her for over 10 years, and she's done my program more than 5 times. And over the years, I'd come back to the camp and I would hear stories about Fatima. Fatima created her own MeWe exercise. She was creating her own storytelling practices for her mental health, which all of us can do. It's not just me, it's anyone listening to this Fearless podcast. It's you. And she created an exercise where she would write stories and have dialogues through meditation to places in nature that she's restricted from because she's a refugee. She's never been to the sea and she can't remember what a forest looks like or feels like because in the desert, you don't have that. But she would have conversations with them. And those conversations and stories she would meditate and create every day was a tether. It reminds me of something someone told me in Gaza, a pediatrician, because in Gaza, there's hundreds of kites always flying in the sky, kites made of trash with colors, right? Black and blues and reds, pinks, plastic bags. And I asked, why are all these kites flying all the time when all these bombs are falling, explosions? And the pediatrician told me there's a thin thread connecting us to these kites, and that kite is free when we're flying it, and it puts color where there's darkness. And it reminds us that we might not be free, but one day we will be free by holding on to this thread. And so for Fatima, her kite and her thread was this storytelling practice in this desolate refugee camp, Zaatari refugee camp. So then once I found out she was doing these practices, me and my co-director, Rafe, um, approached her and we drafted and co-produced with Fatima. Fatima's a co-producer and writer and feature of this, right? This refugee girl, Fatima, Syrian. And we got permission for her to leave the refugee camp for 72 hours, and we took her to the sea for the first time in her life. And we filmed it. And she had a conversation with it. And that was where the connection in my work, like all of it came, right? You do the inner work and you reclaim agency of the story you tell yourself about yourself. And then you create avenues and opportunities for people to connect and unleash their stories with one another. Then you create cultural artifacts authored and produced by the people to penetrate the culture that we're living in with these underrepresented stories and narratives. Then there's systemic change. And through culture, we can achieve systemic change. And Fatima is an example of that because we made, by the way, to all those change makers out there that have an idea and they have no support, I put my own money into this film. People thought I was crazy. People told me not to do it. And that to me now is evidence that I should be doing it because I didn't listen. And we gave Fatima this experience. Even if the film failed, we made her dream and meditation a reality just for 3 days. The process is more important than the product. The process is more important than the result and the output. If the process has a clean intention, it is. So once we made it, I was like, we it's a win. It's a success. And then all of a sudden we started getting into film festivals and then Time Magazine and Time Studios thought it was of a certain quality and compelling enough to buy it, and now it's being distributed by Time Magazine. Fatima's story from Zaatari refugee camp, which came from nothing, is now in Time. And by the way, Fatima just screened her film in Jordan at Princess Basma's, who's she's the princess of Jordan, Princess Basma's Film Festival. She sat next to the Princess of Jordan, watching her film, you know, and Princess Basma was crying and wanted to, get her autograph and, made her feel like a celebrity. And Fatima, this young girl who had her life by all the world standards, right, Adwak? Her story was already written. Syrian, refugee, your story, we know your story. No, you don't. Because she just co-wrote, directed a film that is being seen by the world, and now she's sitting next to literal princess in Jordan, sharing her story and experiences, and actually being a voice for change. That's what's possible.
Hmm. You alluded to your mantra earlier, which is that the stories we tell ourselves inform the way we treat ourselves and
Mm.
others around us.
Mhm.
What is the difference in storytelling from a Kashmiri context versus an American frame?
What a question! What a question! I don't know if it's Kashmiri context because again, there are many Kashmiris who would say you're Kashmiri, but you're not really Kashmiri because you're not here, right? So I have to respect that. But I
Mhm.
would say I definitely come from two different cultures. I come from, Eastern culture, but then I live in the West. Western communication has been weaponized as a tool for othering and has been weaponized as a tool for power. And it is very product focused and output focused. And my approach to storytelling is very much about starting from the place of where your brain is talking to your heart. and listening to that and then engaging in a hero's journey within to restructure and restory that. And the process there is more important than how is it written, what does it look like, how far does it travel. And when you
Let me
start from
let me interrupt you because the hero's journey archetype, the call, the answer to the call of adventure, travel, the dark night of the soul, victory. That's an archetype that crosses cultures.
exactly
Um, yeah. So, and when we
exactly
talk about weaponization and othering, even our cultures, weaponize. We have stories about those people. We don't trust them because they
we
did
do.
this one thing and they did that thing. And so we don't cross that mountain ridge because, or, within my East African context, they're ogres, and that was to keep children, contained, or speaking to a storyteller, and the different introductions to stories like once upon a time, the Aesop's fables, or
Yeah.
the call and response, or story, if you heard that in Nigeria.
Mm.
Yeah, if you were telling I mean, there's something I do, which is whenever I travel to a new place, I try to collect the folklore.
Yeah.
um what would a Kashmiri story or folk tale sound like? How would it begin? How would it end?
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, Kashmiris are very, there's a lot of Sufi vibes in how
Okay.
people speak. There's a lot of poetry. Um, it's very, Aga Shahid Ali was an incredible Kashmiri poet and storyteller, and very reminiscent of like, for me, to Rumi, famous Sufi poet. And so everything is every story in Kashmir, especially from the women who are the backbone of everything all over the world, but in Kashmir, it's the same. There is a fearlessness to confronting and speaking and expressing grief and loss. But then there's a search that goes beyond the grief and the loss for what's the sweet, what's the sweetness, what's the light. And it's almost always goes back to God and something bigger than yourself and gratitude and devotion, you know. Those are real key elements that at least me as an observer to my culture and my people, and I know there's more experts out there, but that those are the things that I really pulled from it.
Mhm.
But when you get those things taken away from you, and here's when I talk about, the Western centric models of communication, we have to acknowledge that a lot of the language around mental health, and we're showing this at the month of mental health awareness and mental health day. The language behind healing and mental health has been colonized by a language that comes from the West, and there's a power dynamic that's at play with who's able to say what story, whose stories do we believe, what's the language of health that is acceptable, that we will pay attention to, and what's the language that we just normalize, right? um,
Give us an example of what you're talking about.
well, let's see. In the 1800s in North America, it was by settlers that were stealing the land of the indigenous peoples of this country, not country, but that land at that time. It was illegal for indigenous languages and sayings and prayers to be spoken or taught in schools in North America. During the time of slavery, if we're talking about Africans and Black Americans, it was illegal for them to learn how to read and write and share their stories publicly in large groups. In Kashmir in 2019, the security forces cut out all the landlines and mobile connectivity for 8 million people after a law changed and protests started happening. So there's this decolonization that needs to happen in how we approach storytelling and communication when it comes to mental health. And there's an acknowledgement that has to come into play of the languages and the cultures and the stories that have been erased systemically and on purpose because communication by those in power has been manipulated to keep certain people down and certain narratives and certain power structures alive. And I think we're living at a time where all of that is now changing. I see it changing for the better, but it also involves a deconstruction of the algorithm with which we've been forced to approach things. And by the way, speaking of algorithms, this connects to your question too, Edouard. The algorithms with which we operate on social media are prioritizing certain narratives and stories and words over others. So this is what I mean when I talk about the weaponization of language and communication, particularly in the West, and it's happening all over the world, even in Kashmir, but certainly see it here. And because the West has profited off of colonization and other systemic injustices, the centers of language and how language is used, particularly when it comes to health, it's been normalized. And so for me, what drives me is the stories and the language of self from the perspective of the survivors. And how can we expand language? There's this saying by Babbage, who was a philosopher, that language was meant to be a continuation, right? Not a conclusion, right? And so, Nigeria, for example, the youth that are living in the Northeast are the solution, and they have the solutions. They don't need the UN to come and tell them what to do, but they need collaboration and safe spaces and partnership. Yes, same in Kashmir. The solutions are within us. In those that are dealing with PTSD, those that are dealing with mental illness and anxiety and depression, as a survivor, I'm speaking to you. You have the resources within you to heal, to be your own solution, to be the protagonist in your own story. You have it within you.
Hmm. Look, you talk about being terrified when you went to Gaza,
Hmm.
and the name of the podcast is Fearless.
Mhm.
Mohsin, what are you afraid of?
I am afraid of losing connectedness to myself, my children, my wife, and the trees and the nature around me. And that's something that, if we're talking about mental health, again, that's a daily fight, which requires a daily practice. Um, so I'm afraid of losing the fight. I'm afraid of losing that will to keep fighting. Yeah, that would be my biggest fear.
Okay, we're winding up now, and I'm sure you can tell in the shift, you know. So, a few more questions before we close the conversation.
Of course.
What is your deepest fear for the world?
Wow, you're asking great questions.
Thank you.
My deepest fear for the world is what we're living through right now, which is we are losing and misusing the skill of connectedness and communication, particularly when it comes to bearing witness to oneself and bearing witness to one another. And when we lose that skill of bearing witness to ourselves and to one another, then we lose community. And when we lose community, we lose everything. All of this goes away. And I would say that's my biggest fear right now in the world.
What's the last thing you did that scared you outside of going to Gaza?
That's the obvious one. Oh, the last thing I did that scared me. Wow, that's another great question. Saying no to some people that I had to say no to because was listening to my intuition and listening to my boundaries, which is painful for me to do because I want to make everybody happy all the time and don't want to disappoint people, but I had to, and I'm glad I did.
And finally, three things in your fear busting toolkit.
Mm. Reflection and praying and awareness. You can call it praying, you can call it reflection, you can call it awareness, but having silence and making a space for myself to have prayer and silence and reflection every day. There's a saying, a very famous quote, and I can't remember the name, but she wrote, it's a woman, and she said, "Courage is fear that has said its prayers." And so that always has stuck with me. And so in those moments where I have to you have to fight for your space every day to have silence and reflection and prayer. And in those moments, um, you know, acknowledging that my thoughts are just thoughts. Not every thought is an eternal truth. It's just a cloud in the sky, but I am the sky, as the saying goes. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is nature. Being in nature and listening to the bird songs and seeing the green in the trees. There's a lot of research and science, even amazing research out of Japan about how walks in the forest actually reduces your stress cortisol hormone levels in your body, like in your blood. It reduces your heart rate, slows down your
Forest bathing.
forest bathing. It's a real thing, you know. So nature is medicine. And then the last thing for me is creativity. Creative practice allows you to exercise your agency for creating something from nothing. And it expands your agency for problem solving and perspective taking. So those would be my three: stillness and prayer and reflection, um, nature, number two, and the third is creative practice. What creative practice can I do today, even if it's for 5 minutes?
We'll end our conversation there. Mohsin Mohi-Ud-Din, thank you so very much for your time on Fearless today.
No, thank you for giving me the space. This was medicine for me too, talking to you and being heard and challenged. So thank you.